Are we ready? Megan, let's give it just about 2 more minutes. Are you okay with that? I'm just waiting for a few more people to sign on. Okay, we're ready to go. Welcome to the Wellbeing Blueprint's Wage Transparency event. I'm Natalie Williams, Director of the Wellbeing Blueprint, and I'm excited to have you here today. Today, just to start with a little bit of housekeeping, put your names, your intros into the chat with your pronouns and where you're from. That helps us capture where you are, but also helps us introduce you if you want to speak directly to our speaker today. You will notice that we have ASL interpreters, so please use them if needed. Also, if you need closed captioning, you can hit the CC button at the bottom of your screen if it's not already on. Any technical issues that you may have, please contact Sasha Green. She will put her name in the chat now, and you can reach directly out to her, and she will help you with what you need for any tech issues. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions to the presenter. If you want to ask a question directly and not just have us read it, raise your hand. We will call on you and you'll be promoted to the panel and can ask directly. Now that that's out of the way, a really important part of my day today is to acknowledge the land on which I stand, belonging to the Kawachaka people and the Sano Akayos peoples. I acknowledge their elders, both past and present, as well as their future generations. I acknowledge that the rights and cultures of Indigenous people throughout the country have been excluded and erased as it relates to the land we all stand on. My acknowledgement demonstrates my commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. The Wellbeing Blueprint is a place where we're all gathered to advance a country where everyone has a fair shot at well-being. In our conversation today, we will explore the topic of wage transparency, a very important topic and near and dear to many people's hearts, and I think we can all relate. Through the Wage Transparency Act, through the Wage Transparency and its impact on well-being for businesses and for people and for communities. This conversation will also cover ways to advance legislative action through actionable steps seen through the journey of the Wage Transparency Act. I am so honored to have the Wellbeing Blueprint signer, Megan Driscoll, present to us today. Megan is a speaker, an author, and an award-winning business leader. She's the founder and former CEO of PharmaLogics, a global human capital organization established in 2003, with a staff of over 200 employees and 50 million in revenue. She led the company to receive several notable achievements, including recognition as a best place to work by the Boston Business Journal, the Boston Globe, and Inc. magazine. A 7-time Inc. 5,000 fastest growing private company in the US. And in 2018, she was named the Boston Chamber of Commerce Small Business CEO of the Year. Megan is a staunch advocate for gender equality, motivated by the lack of females in leadership roles and in both the public and private sector. Megan has created a movement towards greater transparency in pay as a way of leveling the playing field for all people. Along with her local 50 co-sponsoring legislators, she has recently filed a bill titled An Act Relative to Wage Transparency in Massachusetts State Legislature, which will require employers to share compensation wage ranges with current and potential employees. Thank you, Megan, for being with us here today, and welcome. You're on mute.
That wasn't a good start. Thanks for having me. So excited to be here and talk about wage equity and generally speaking, talk about how other people can learn from the experience and go out on their own and sort of be the change they want to see in the world.
So Megan, I'm going to start with one question, and then I know that we're going to show a short video to kind of double down on what that experience was like to you. But can you tell me, how did you begin the work?
So I started my company when I was really young. I was 25 years old. And I was aware of being a female leader wasn't common, but I didn't have a lot of time to think about the ramifications of that or what that might mean for my business or for my employees, nonetheless. I was also had a really growing family. I had my first child. I also then quickly got pregnant with my second child while my business was growing. And although I understood the challenges that face people of color and women, I really didn't pay a lot of attention to it until we started hiring people. And they're like your greatest teacher. You just learn what's important through the eyes of the people that work for you. And I started to become more interested in how to be a great boss, how to run a company that's fair and equitable, and what does that mean? And so I started asking questions and going to conferences and trying to kind of soak in and learn as much as I could. And in one of the conferences that I went to was for Inc. sponsor winner. So we were a fastest growing private company, as you mentioned, for 7 years straight. We still are on that list. And they had a speaker there. His name was Dan Price. He's been on the cover of magazines at this point. People may have heard his name before, but he's called the 70,000 year CEO. And he basically talked about how he had raised his minimum wage in his company from, I think they were around 40 to 70. And he did it over the course of 3 years, but he was talking about what did a living wage really mean? What was a living wage? And every time I would go to an event, I would always take the context of what someone's saying and then apply it to my business. And so in my business, our lowest paid earners were entry-level recruiters, and they could earn up to $60,000 to $70,000 their first year. That was base and bonus. So their base was $38,000, and then they could earn the difference in commission. And many of them did. Very few people made less than $50,000. But when I was listening to him talk about what a living wage really meant, a person can't apply for a mortgage or get a rent or get a new car based on total comp. They're getting those things based on what their base pay is. And it's impossible to live in Boston on $38,000 a year. I mean, that's just a virtual impossibility. People do it, but it is very hard to make a living at $38,000. And even though our job was entry level, we did have people all ranges of ages, some with kids, taking that job and doing really well at that. And so it was basically after meeting him, I think I met him and heard his story in October. I essentially, on the flight home on the back of a napkin, was like, okay, how do I get everybody to a higher wage within our company? So I decided to move every person from $38,000 to $50,000. And then I had to bump people who were more senior up too, because it kind of then became close to their base pay without bonus. So essentially I was, it worked out to be about $500,000 in profit that I was going to redistribute into people's salaries. Luckily, as the primary owner of the company, I could do whatever I want. There were many people in my management team who thought that was a ridiculous thing to do, wasn't necessary. And I just really strongly, it was so impactful on me to hear and to feel so strongly about a living wage that I just did it anyway. And interestingly enough, a year later, I was back at the Inc. conference. Dan Price was there, and I met him afterwards, and I said, I followed your lead, and all these amazing things had happened at my company. So what I knew was that we not only did we not lose profit, we increased our profit by like 20%. Our revenue went up by 16%. And people were so much happier, so much more productive. We were sending out more resumes every single week. We were getting more business. The vibe overall in my company after doing that was just incredibly different. And that leads us to this video, which I think kind of ties a bow on it. He worked with someone who worked for me to surprise me after I met him at that year date. And it was so cool to see this video be done, because I learned so much more about what was going on with my employees that I didn't know about, that I learned through them developing this video of what the increase in base pay meant to them. So I guess we can do the video.
Awesome. Let's go there.
Okay. All right, Natalie, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Hey, Megan.
Oh my God.
Am I late for yoga?
Oh my God. Oh my God.
We're going to have a minimum $70,000 pay rate for everyone that works here.
I hope it sets an example for companies all over this
My
country.
name is Shayna Moran. I'm a project manager. Been with PharmaLogics for about 2 years. So I was living in a basement in Jamaica Plain in the city of Boston, bottom floor of this 3-floor house. There were bugs in it, let's just say that. It wasn't completely finished, there weren't windows.
It ended up being almost an hour commute each way, which definitely really just added to the stress of the workday.
We were living in our parents' basement. It was a struggle. We really couldn't really save much to really purchase a home.
If I could be part of a shift where business ceases to be about making money as the most important goal and starts to be about purpose, service, solving the problems of humanity. So as soon as I'm in the majority on that, I'm ready to go. And I decided that's the one thing that I want to do business-wise before I die. Hey, Megan.
Oh my God.
Am I late for yoga?
Oh my God.
Sorry.
So you're here. Oh my God.
I don't want to interrupt. Maybe.
Where were you?
I was just out there, but
Oh my God.
I came for yoga.
Oh my God. In my office. He's been in my office. So it was the Inc. 5000 conference 2 years ago. And I said, I don't have a question. I just want to let you know that I heard you speak last year. And I came back from that conference in October. And by January, we had changed up everybody's base salaries. We got everybody to, I think, from a $38,500 to a $50,000 base. I said, I just want to thank you for the idea, because it's made a huge impact. And this year we've won all these awards, and people really love working here. And I'm crying about it because it was such a important thing to have happen. So then after the fact,
I said I would love to come visit you guys and meet you.
In January, we found out that my wife was pregnant. And no better timing from the announcement with Megan to now, find out that we were going to welcome our baby girl into the world.
This is a totally different company. Actually the space we're sitting in now didn't exist. The wall was, this didn't exist. It pretty much cut off at that post right there. So we literally knocked down walls.
I was so elated in that moment because I knew that I could make some serious life changes that I had been wanting to make for a long time.
So I live now a 4-mile drive to the office. I don't take the highway, it's all back roads and takes about 10 minutes.
I really want to thank you because I personally
Thank
feel
you so
very
much.
successful because of your advice, and I implemented it, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I got a little teary watching it again
Yeah.
because it was so impactful for me.
What an amazing experience. And thank you for sharing with us that. I think what came to mind is when we take action, no matter where we are in the world, everybody benefits. And so I saw that your business grew, your employees, they were able to really create a deeper sense of well-being in their life. And I think just feel valued. Tell us how your interest in a living wage brought you to the fight for equal pay, because that's really what it's been, is, you know, advancing this discussion around a topic that is not comfortable for everybody to lean into as an employee or even as an employer.
Yeah. So I think, you know, once I had made the change internally and I saw and experienced what a dramatic difference, you know, we were a great company beforehand. It just allowed us to kind of become unleashed, if you will. And so it's like a muscle, right? You have some success and you flex that muscle. It's like in sales. Once you're a little good at sales, then you get a little bit better, but it's all confidence. And so I became pretty confident that I could do more than really what was within my walls, you know, and focus on things that really matter to me. Although a living wage is incredibly important to me. Dan, that's kind of his fight, and he's brought that. He continues to kind of hammer down on that. But I also sensed that there were issues that were even greater and more important to me. And over the years of building a company, I was very conscious about what I paid everybody. And so, and I also was very promotive of women. So we had 60% of our staff was women, over 70% of our leadership team was female. When I actually sold my company to a private equity firm, I sort of required that we have females on the board. So I was actively pursuing those things. And as you actively pursue those things, you realize how inactively pursued it is by others. And I sort of decided that I was going to use PharmaLogics as a platform to show that equal pay is good for companies. So we went to a fully transparent pay policy about 2 years after we made our living wage change. And we essentially shared salary ranges for every single role. We published the pay ranges when you applied for roles at PharmaLogics. Once you were hired at PharmaLogics, we showed you where you would be for every single job at every single increase. That even furthered that connection between employee and company too, because they knew that the person next to them wasn't earning more than they were earning. They were all earning the same amount within they were tight windows, and we give them ranges, but tight windows. And so in the process of doing that, we actually got the notice of the Boston Women's Workforce Council, which was a Marty Walsh initiative, where they were really tackling wage inequality in Massachusetts, and did a lot of research and work to understand that Massachusetts doesn't do any better than national averages as it relates to equal pay for women and people of color. So they heard about our wage transparency policy at our company. We actually won an award, an innovation award for that as a best practice. And that, again, just strengthened my interest in this area. But sort of a defining thing also occurred, which was in 2016, Massachusetts passed an Equal Pay Act. Nobody really heard about it right away because it gets passed, but it takes a couple of years for it to get enacted. So it was enacted in July of 2018. So as somebody who was a business owner and really interested in the social responsibility piece of paying people fairly, I was fairly excited about the Equal Pay Act and kind of what it would do for Massachusetts. And I realized that very quickly that the Equal Pay Act did not do what it set out to do. And not only did it not really help women and people of color, it also was not good for businesses. It made it very hard to hire candidates when you've removed the salary information and yet not replaced it with like any other process to make the process fair. So that's kind of when I started to get involved with the legislative process and thought that if the Equal Pay Act can pass, then something else should be able to be passed to fix the problems with the Equal Pay Act. And that's kind of where the legislation part began. And I just generally began to feel strongly that I can do what's right in my company of 250 employees, and I have a responsibility to do so. And I can advocate for that with other people. But I'm only so small, right? The fact that I affect 250 people, I felt that the message needed to go broader. I felt that the more people needed to kind of get on board and kind of coalesce around this issue. And so I really wanted to take it outside the walls of just my small company.
Awesome. In saying that, what comes to mind is this kind of not fully understanding how these laws are put into action, how legislative advocacy works. But before that, I want to ask you, like, what would I be entitled to in Massachusetts as an employee because of this act? How would that work for me?
So if this act passes, if it passes through the legislature this year, which all things are going in the right direction. And so it's an issue currently. So currently, and in most states around the country, with the exception of a few, there is you can no longer, in Massachusetts, I'm not forced to share my current salary. So a company can no longer ask me that question. But what's been replaced by that question is, what are your salary expectations? And what we found and what we know is that men are better at giving higher expectations. And our expectations are often founded on what we're currently earning. So although we are eliminating the question of what you're actually earning, we're setting up the same situation with just a different question. And because companies in Massachusetts don't have to share what the pay range is for the role that you're applying for, and 95% of the time they don't, because of that,
sorry, y'all. I know there's
it's a game that you don't really know where you, oh shoot, is it me?
Yeah, but it's okay. Just for those on the line, Megan has some weather moving through, so we're just processing through that. Again, I apologize, you all. I think you're good now, Megan.
Okay, good. I just went to shut my router. I have two routers in my house, so I went to shut one of them off. We lost power this morning due to the rain, so things are a little bit dicey, but hopefully this makes it better. So essentially, because we've eliminated that question, right, and we've put in place this nebulous sort of answer anything by what are your expectations, it has resulted in men getting paid even more for jobs because their expectations are higher. Also, the Equal Pay Act didn't do anything for people in seats. So for example, less than 5% of the population changes jobs year over year. So the Equal Pay Act really didn't do anything for anybody in seats who are currently earning less. There are two reasons why women and people of color earn less. Number one is there's less people of color and women at the top, so those high wage earners. And number two is they're often in the range for the role, but they're at the bottom of the range for the role. So this legislation would require that companies share the salary range for a job when a candidate applies. So when we're giving our expectations, we're giving them in keeping with what we know about the job, what the job will pay. And then secondly, for any employee in a seat, they can ask their employer what the pay range is for the job that they're in. And that gives them an enormous amount of power they don't currently have in terms of advocating for themselves, right? So if the pay range is 60 to 80 and I'm at 62, then I can have a pretty serious and honest conversation with, what do I need to do to get to 80? What are the responsibilities I need to take on? What are the skills that I lack, right? So it's a tool in the toolbox for negotiation that's super powerful. So that's what the Wage Transparency Act would require.
That's great. You know, it makes me think, as I am a woman of color, there's been a lot of instances when I've been fearful to ask about pay or to ask about the range, that maybe I wouldn't get the job because they thought I was too aggressive, or that it was an uncomfortable conversation. I didn't want to rock the boat. So I can see the impact for me personally of having it already on the table and not having to ask that question because it's like a known to everybody. What have you seen as a larger impact? So talk a little bit about the impact to your company and what you saw, and maybe to the individuals on a larger scale from pursuing this legislation.
Yeah, so I'll give you a recent example. I was working with a candidate whom ended up getting downsized for her role, but was working like in upstate New York. And so pay isn't as aggressive as it would be in the Boston market or the California market or whatnot. But she was a PhD chemist, lost her job during COVID, was very unsure and unwilling to make a big move at the time of COVID. So she ended up just taking a job in like a quality control department, which is very overqualified for that job. So she took a pay cut. She was earning like $90,000. She took a $20,000 pay cut, but to stay employed during COVID. This past year, she decided that she needed, she felt more comfortable. She felt like she could move. She felt like she could really start her job search. So she was interviewing with a company in Boston, and the company did not share the pay range for the role. And they were interested in making her an offer. And they asked her what her salary expectations were. And I told her flat out, do not answer that question. Leave it blank. Let them make you an offer. Because her thought was, well, if I put like 105, it's more than I was earning before and way more than I was earning when I took my step back. I said, nope, you're going to say nothing. You're going to leave it empty, leave it blank. The company made her an offer at $145,000. Now, two things happened. The company overpaid, right? Because I bet they paid her at the top of the range because they really wanted her. So probably the range was 125 to 145 is what I'm guessing, right? The company overpaid for that talent. And she, by not answering the question, right, was paid a fair salary or more than fair salary. And so everyone would have won still had the company shared the pay range data. Because if there was 125 to 145, she would have said 125 is amazing. It's $15,000 more than I was earning 8 months ago in a job that I'd really love, right? And so it's just all about, when you add sunlight, everybody wins. It's not an anti-business policy. It's a pro-business policy that also has positive impacts for women and people of color. And so at PharmaLogics, when we made that change, right, people didn't feel like they had to leave their employer to gain more money. They knew exactly what was going to be coming to them as they made these sacrifices. It also made it seem more worth it, right? Like, oh, this jump to that role is going to give me $20,000 more. I'm going to work really, really hard so that I get that job. And so it just lays the groundwork for people to feel more motivated, even within the walls of your own company. So I think that, one of the things that's been, I think that's hard to come by, especially as it relates to legislation, is coming up with something that's pro-business and pro-person. You often have social impact and business constraints that are kind of mashing up against one another. This actually has positive business. It's positive for business and it's positive for people. And so that's why I think we've gotten so much interest in the bill, and why I think it will do very well and quite frankly pass just in this session. And I think that's something that, as people think about issues that they want to try to attack, is to not think about it only solely in one direction, right? Well, this is a huge social impact. Does it have a business impact, right? Can there be an argument made for why this would be good for business or pro-business? And not that it always can, but what I will say is that it's easier to push forward on a topic where you have consensus. And I've been told many times in the last 2 years that I've been working on this legislation that if business isn't behind it, it's almost virtually impossible to pass unless you have a groundswell of support, like people out there picketing every weekend. Unfortunately, that's just the way things go. So that's just been good advice, and one that I didn't need to take because I when I originally put this law together, that I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the business issues that it was created because I experienced them as an employer and as a recruiter who was seeing it on the ground real time, like play out with companies, losing candidates because they didn't know the salaries and all kinds of issues that it created, the Equal Pay Act created for businesses. But I do think that that's an important aspect of like what would make a good bill.
What are some boardroom shockers that you really kind of blew your mind? Back office, stuff that we wouldn't know unless we were in those circles occurred.
There's a lot of women in politics who don't like women. I've been very, very surprised at the pushback. So I own my own company, so I didn't really ever have to like report to any women. Before I started my company, I had a male boss. And then after that, I started my own business. When people would talk about how women don't support women, it would always be like, really? That seems crazy. I really experienced that within the first, like having a good idea and it not be another woman's great idea in politics. That didn't go over so well. I was really surprised by that. I'm also really surprised at when you officially come out on a topic, whatever it is, when you make a position on something, at how many people want to tear that down and that shock you. Like friends of mine who would argue with me about the fact that there is equal pay. And I'm like, I don't know what planet we're living on. It might just be the divisive sort of polarized environment that we're living in, but I was very shocked by that. I kind of expected everyone to, everybody knows this is a problem, right? And I was kind of surprised, a bit naive, I guess, to think that everybody would think this is a great idea. That has been, I don't think super surprising, but to me, who feels like, someone who is confident in sort of the information that I'm using to, I'm sharing real life data and someone still telling me that that's not true. It's very hard to understand how you get to that place. So that was kind of shocking to me. And also how hard it is to pass legislation, really. I mean, it requires, a lot of people kind of coming together and agreeing to move forward. But the legislative process is slow. So patience is really important. And I don't have a lot of patience in general, just not my strong suit. So I've learned that I've got to kind of like take a step back, give people space to consider things, revisit, and not expect things to happen overnight because they just don't happen overnight.
Awesome. Thank you. So tell us a little bit about the process for legislative action. How did it begin? What is your blueprint that you followed?
Yeah. And what's funny is, this particular legislation falls directly in the sort of like 6 tenets of the Wellbeing Blueprint, right? Like that you are starting with something that matters to people, right? And, pushing against harms being concentrated in communities that are already faced with the greatest adversity. What's so important about this law now is the timing of it, right? We have pushed women out of the workforce in such a substantial way. And we've pushed them out, for a variety of reasons. Many of them have left the workforce because of the situation around them and their families. But what kind of workforce are they coming back to, right? So it's so important that we pass legislation that allows women to enter back into the workforce and not take a collective step back, right, in pay. And then, when you talk about building financial security, when you listen to stories of women, especially people of color, women of color, and the obstacles that they have faced to financial security, it's incredible. They have more debt, right? There's just the structural racism that exists, and how it's like fundamental to their process in life of financial security. And so if there's a way that we can help women, and particularly women of color, enter back into this workforce in a way that puts them ahead and not behind, that's what we need. We have to do it. So I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but to lay the groundwork of how it goes with the Wellbeing Blueprint. But the legislative process is actually a lot simpler than I think people think it is. And I think people feel like it's a pretty daunting task. But essentially, I started this off I had a problem, right? So I knew that companies were struggling to make hires after the Equal Pay Act was put in place. and that the Equal Pay Act didn't, in fact, actually really help women and people of color in helping them achieve financial changes in their lives. And then also I was kind of just bummed out that the Equal Pay Act didn't do anything for people who were in seats already. And we're never going to make a move towards equal pay if we're only dealing with the 5% job changers every year. So I knew there was a problem that I wanted to tackle and fix. So my first step was I met with my local legislator. So his name's Josh Cutler. He represents Plymouth County, the towns that I live in. And I asked him if he would meet for coffee, and I had an idea that I wanted to talk with him about. So that's how it started. I basically introduced myself and I told him all about what I had experienced, what I was thinking. Was there a way that this could be tackled legislatively? I asked him just about is there an amendment to the law? I knew nothing about this at all. And so we had a great first meeting where he just kind of filled me in with the background stuff. It can't be an amendment to it, but it can be its own separate legislation. And here's what you'd need to do. And have you talked to this person? Have you talked to that person? And so he led me to a bunch of really successful women in Boston who I had not met, who were dealing with issues along the lines of equal pay in Massachusetts. And I set up meetings with them and we chatted and we talked about the law. And so it just kind of evolved from there, really. And we were able to, I met with several people out on my own. I came back to them and told them what I found out, which was there was consensus that this was an issue and needed to be addressed. And then from that point forward, we actually, I got a puppy. Always on home Zoom. And so after that, we had some consensus about what we should do next. And he helped me set up meetings. Our first meeting was with the Attorney General, who essentially, again, clarified that everything that I was saying was happening on the ground was actually happening, where companies were calling and getting frustrated with hiring and losing candidates, and the Equal Pay Act was not helping anybody. And so that led to some additional meetings. And then finally, he agreed, I think we should put this together as legislation. And so from the time I had lunch with him or breakfast with him, coffee, to the time we actually put that in place, I want to say it was probably 6 months.
That's awesome. And then follow up to that, is it your experience and seeing this process through that those legislators want to meet with citizens, that they want to hear your voice?
Yeah, they really do. And I think, there's some legislators do town halls. If those have been really spotty related to COVID, they've just not been well attended. But you can absolutely call your legislator, introduce yourself, tell them you have a problem and ask them to meet. That is their job. Their job is to represent you. And there should be no issue with doing that. Many of them hold other jobs or, are in they either live in the area, they live in one of the towns that they're representing. So it's not like they're very far from where you are. And their job is to take a meeting from you. What needs to happen is you need to have your I's dotted and your T's crossed before you show up there, right? It can't be a couple of people have called me and said, I got this idea, and I just gave them you probably should call this person first or get some more data. You got to kind of come to them with a firsthand experience of why this is an issue and be able to articulate that. And so if you can do that, then there's no reason why that meeting shouldn't go well.
Awesome, thanks. Well, I wanted to open it up for questions from the audience now, and just see, do you have questions or thoughts that you want to share during our time together today? So I have one question is, what do you think is the biggest barrier to supporting living wages and wage transparency?
Biggest barrier. Well, I think as it relates to living wage, there are significant issues as it relates to sort of this corporate America. You've seen it on the news where the company doesn't do well, but the CEO makes $5 million, $10 million, it's just it's sort of silly, right? So I think that there's a lack of understanding amongst corporate CEOs of what does a living wage really do for your employees, right? So there's a lack of even knowing what it means or caring. There's a lack of understanding of what it can possibly do for your company overall. It's a relatively newer concept, to be honest, not one that's very well employed. And so I think that's one of the barriers for living wage. However, as it relates to wage equality and equal pay, we have made a lot of progress. It has been a topic that people have talked about for many, many years. It's not a new one. And when you speak to people who are in HR or in executive leadership, everyone's talking about how to engage their employees in a more diverse, in a more fair, equitable way. So this is a topic that many, many companies are trying to tackle. Even if you look at as an example, like a State Street here in Massachusetts, they're a compact signer, meaning Boston Women's Workforce Council has said you're going to pay women and men fairly and people of color fairly, and they've said yes, absolutely we are. Yet they're like one of the largest contributors to the discrepancy in pay, and the reason is that those companies have gone on 20 years, 30 years without thinking about equal pay as they hired, right? So they have inequities in every level, big disparities between what their white males are earning and everybody else. And that takes time to fix. So although they want to fix the problem, it's billions and billions of dollars they would have to infuse to fix the problem overnight. So this has to be what we call like a walk-in solution, right? Where we can make these little changes over time that have a big impact. And so this is one of the ways. In fact, a few of the Equal Pay Acts that have recently been passed, like in Connecticut as an example, have included this language that I'm proposing now as an amendment to the legislation, but they're including it right off the bat because they know that they need to provide more than just taking away the salary. There needs to be more done as it relates to wage transparency to really make a difference.
Another question that came through the chat is, will there be consequences for employers who don't post wage ranges under this bill? Or is there a plan to incentivize employers to make this change once the bill passes?
Yeah, so there is some, we have employed the ramifications with the Equal Pay Act, which basically state that it's against the law to do so. Those would be in place for this legislation as well. So you could, as an employee, file a complaint with the Attorney General that they're not following that process, and the Attorney General would take that on seriously because that would fall under their purview for managing. So yes, you could, and as an example, you could do that right now. If someone in Massachusetts asks you what you're currently earning, you can call the Attorney General and they're in violation of the Equal Pay Act. And there are ramifications that are associated with that the Attorney General would pursue.
Awesome. What other states are looking at passing legislation similar to this?
So Colorado has recently passed some equal pay. They've been in a little bit of hot water. Their law is actually getting litigated against. California, New York City, not the state, Connecticut, a few others have it like on their books. It's probably 14 to 15 states have either passed equal pay acts similar to Massachusetts or have gone further, or have equal pay acts on the books, meaning they're going through the legislative process like this act is as well.
Do you think that this will impact the advancement of, I know we've talked a lot about women and advancing, but of people of color into positions of decision-making in organizations?
I think I think that equal pay, equality in the workplace is extremely complicated, and there's lots of different facets to it. For example, I'm just gonna. This is the thing of working from home with dogs. I'm so sorry. So I think that it's a really complicated issue. Like, for example, there's legislation in Massachusetts right now about making sure you have a certain percentage of women on boards and people of color on boards. And so that's tackling one issue. Then you have the issue of this, just sort of general wage equality. And then you have just leadership, how many women leaders. There is another legislation that's also being proposed, which is like a reporting mechanism. So the state doesn't have a handle, basically, if you will, on how bad this problem is, right? we don't really know because nobody reports that. There's some EEOC guidelines that go to the federal government, but on a state level, nobody really understands how deep the problem is. The Boston Women's Workforce Council in Massachusetts did shine a light on it, but we don't really know exactly how it's happening, how frequently it's happening, how big the wage gap is, and also necessarily what companies are doing to fix it, right? It's a little bit of everybody knows it's a problem, but nobody really knows how to fix it. So I think you have to go at this from a couple different angles, right? You have to approach it from the women on boards, to executive leadership, which will be next after women on boards, to generally equal pay within a job function. Someone, white man Paul, should not be earning $80,000 when the job pays 60 to 80 if Sarah is earning 62 and they're doing the same job. It's just not fair. But I also think that we have a huge issue as it relates to flexibility for women, because we can't keep moving forward without addressing childcare. I mean, we just can't. So at some point, there's that issue that holds women back no matter what. And so I would love to say, and I've told this to people, like if we pass this legislation, we're going to help a lot of women and people of color advocate for themselves, make it easier for them to get paid fairly, and make the process, equal on the boards just a little bit more for everyone. But we're not going to solve all these other issues that surround this problem and create this problem, which is access to childcare, women in leaders, things like that. It also comes down to student debt, and they are all related. And so I think that it's a multifaceted, very complicated problem. But I'm heartened to know there are lots of people like me that are pushing forward on these things and trying to make a difference in these areas. And if you're interested in any of this, I encourage you to get in touch with me. I'll hook you up with people who are pushing forward on these different topics, because it does require sort of manpower and interest and influence.
One question that came is curious about the implications, but also the process for small nonprofits, even small org startups, where the positions aren't already standardized. And also there may be founders or other parties involved. How do you get to a place where transparency is possible?
So one of the things about the current legislation is it wouldn't kick in until you're 50 employees, because that's when you sort of have to have you have laws that kick in at 50 employees, where you probably need someone in human resources to start managing all of your hiring and your management of your retention of your employees. The idea, though, is that it wouldn't be like overnight when you're 50, you all of a sudden start thinking about, I have to now make sure that I pay people fairly and share wage data and all that kind of stuff, right? It's that you are starting and developing your company with those principles in mind, right? Because at 50, you're going to have to start doing it. And so one of the things that I think for people who work in small businesses, right, and who have influence within small businesses, and I would venture, my feeling on this is anybody who works anywhere has influence, right? You're an employee of the company, you have influence. To carefully have those conversations with people whom are in power to make those decisions about best practices for hiring, about wage transparency, leading them to places like the Boston Women's Workforce Council or other places within your state that have this kind of data that not only supports that companies do better when they have equal pay, right? And when they have equality within the workforce in general, companies have better client satisfaction, better employee satisfaction, they make more money. There's a lot of resources out there. McKinsey does a ton of really great work on women in the workforce. Harvard Business School has put out a ton of research on this topic. So I think there's ways in which you can introduce the topic to those people who are in charge and who make those decisions about being mindful of that growth before it becomes an issue. Like for State Street, right? 20,000 employees, how are they going to fix that problem even if they want to? Way too big, way too expensive. Got to walk into it somehow slowly. But small companies have this opportunity to never make that mistake in the beginning, by educating themselves and the people at B who make those decisions as to how to successfully create an environment where you're thoughtful about pay from an equity standpoint, a fairness standpoint. And I'm happy to speak to organizations about how we did it. as a small business. I've spoken on this topic quite a bit. I'm happy to come and talk about what are the steps that you can take within your organization to make sure that you're paying people equally and fairly, and why wage transparency is really good for your company, whether it be a nonprofit or not. So I'm happy to deal specifically with organizations on this topic, but I also am, mindful that you can do it yourself too. But if you don't feel comfortable, I'm happy to get involved in any way I can, because there's so much data to show why this is just good for business overall.
What are your thoughts about women and women of color in essential low-paying jobs and how to have a positive impact on their lives and wages?
Yeah, so I'm like really, I'm really frustrated with companies' lack of care for what I would call our minimum wage workers. I spent a lot of time actually in Massachusetts at the Capitol when we were pushing the minimum, the $15 minimum wage. I was there as a speaker on behalf of business. And I just think, and I've said this to anybody who will listen, that it is fundamentally unfair for someone who works 40 hours a week to not be able to put food on their table, to not be able to pay their rent and feed their kids. Like, it is a fundamental disaster that happens in every state in our country. It's just wrong. And that has to get changed. I was really heartened the other day. I think I just saw, it wasn't Wendy. It was maybe a Wendy's that had raised their base pay to $17.90. In some state, I think out west, basically, and their competition was paying $11. But this sort of fight for talent has sort of driven up that base pay. We have to be talking about the cost of our goods. If we're selling our product for less than it costs to make it, because we're making it on $8, $9 minimum wage, then we have our whole priorities are screwed up, and we need to be reassessing what we charge for the services or the products that we make, because we cannot be providing those on the backbone of women and people of color and our low wage earners. It is just fundamentally wrong. I don't know the solution to that. I know there are people like me. Dan Price is one of them. Lots of people who are talking about this, but it has to be addressed. I was happy to see a Wendy's pay $17.90. Like, that made me kind of happy to see that maybe, just maybe, we're on the precipice of companies realizing that you can't get talent because you're not paying them enough. Like, they can't feed their kids, so they're not taking your crappy job. I just hope that we just have to keep talking about it. Leaders have to keep talking about it.
One of the questions came up that businesses like the idea in theory, but don't want more regulation based on working on similar issues on dignity at work as part of the advocacy. Are you bringing business leaders on board? And if so, what's your messaging around that?
So it was a little bit easier for me because the Equal Pay Act caused a problem for businesses. When you took away that base salary question, they were left with this expectation answer, which some people didn't even answer. So you had them making offers to candidates, and then the candidate would say, well, I earn more than that already. Why would I take that? And the company would be so frustrated. So this was happening over and over again in Massachusetts. Candidates were not taking jobs. Clients were making offers to candidates and they weren't taking them because they were way less. It was just frustrating. So the legislation that I put forward, although is secretly awesome for women and people of color, it also addressed a pretty significant business need. And so from my perspective, it was easier for me to say. However, I did have to get them on board. So I had been a member of a chamber of commerce throughout my whole business life. So I basically approached a bunch of the chambers of commerce and went to them and talked to them about this business issue. What I tried to do when I spoke to the business community was focus on the business issue and not so much focus on the social impact of the issue, but focus on the business reasons why this was good. And that's kind of why I mentioned at the beginning, if there's a way that you can turn this into a problem solve for the business community, it's going to make it easier for you to get businesses and support in general. Like when I met with Josh Cutler, his first question to me was, how is this going to affect businesses? That was the first question he asked me. So one of the things that I would say is, we often look at issues sort of through our singular lens, right? I would talk to people about how what you're trying to accomplish affects the business community. Are there any positives? Is there any silver lining for that community to kind of get on board with and then run with that, basically? But I've actually had, I think, 8 or 9 chambers of commerce sign on as co-sponsors, not co-sponsors, but supporters of the legislation. They've written letters. They came to the first hearing. It encompasses about 5,000 Massachusetts businesses through those 7 or 8 chambers that I've gotten on board. They're big ones: Springfield, Taunton, Quincy, Plymouth. So that's been my take, is to kind of go that route. I've gone away from trying to get the big corporate companies. There's just too much bureaucracy, in my opinion. So I've kind of gone the Chamber of Commerce route. But I've also worked with like AIM, which is a pretty conservative manufacturing organization who, has changed their tune in the last several years, is really involved and interested in issues related to women and minorities and diversity. And then there's lots of, like the Black Economic Council, for example. They've supported our Amplify Latinx, which is a Latina business organization. They're on board. So there's a lot of places you can go once you kind of get involved in it. There's a lot of places you can go by asking a lot of questions and taking the time to make those phone calls to people to understand how what you're thinking could affect them.
Making the wage information transparent is one giant step. Overcoming social conditioning of not discussing money, especially in the Commonwealth, seems like another hill to climb. Do you have a sense that attitudes are changing towards this type of self-advocacy around salaries and income?
Yeah, so the Equal Pay, one of the other tenets of the Equal Pay Act that was passed was that you no longer could penalize employees for talking about pay. Not everybody might be aware that is part of the Equal Pay Act, but that did get enacted. So if you think about that, prior to 2018, companies could fire you for talking about pay. So that was a significant change, right? That's no longer an option to be fired for that reason. That doesn't say it doesn't happen, right? It does happen, but people would have a leg to stand on to call the Attorney General and to argue that fact if they did. I do think that today people are much more willing and it's more commonplace to talk about what people are earning, right? I do think there's been a social effect to that. At least I saw it, within the people that I worked with. It became less taboo, if you will. I do think, and so things take time to change, right? Like, as an example, the Equal Pay Act caused a problem for businesses because you no longer could ask that question of what are you earning. Some companies took the prospective position of starting to share the salaries because they didn't want to waste their time with candidates who weren't going to take their job anymore. Now, it's still a small number of companies, but it's many, many more companies share pay data today than they did before the Equal Pay Act. So as it relates to that, I currently in Massachusetts, you cannot be penalized for talking about pay. And that is the state of the state, if you will. And I do think that attitudes are changing. I think attitudes are slow to change, but I do think they are changing. And I think everybody should, if you didn't know that, you should share that information, right? Like, people need to know that there's nothing wrong with sharing salary ranges. And I will also say that some of the reason why companies have gotten on board to support the legislation that I've proposed is because there's a little bit of a rumor mill that started, right? So I'm talking to you and now we're sharing pay range data. And I'm like, hey, you earn way more than me. What the heck? But I'm taking your word for it, right? It's not necessarily a true number. So companies have picked up on that there's this disproportionate connection with what's reality and what's actually happening, right? And I'll give you a very good example. We at PharmaLogics did, like, it wasn't a research study, but we took like 60, 70 of our employees, and like half were women and half were men. And we asked them, have you ever inflated your salary in conversation with friends or family? Like 10, 15% of the women said yes. 90% of the men we asked said yes, that they had inflated their salaries when talking to friends and family. So I think that there's a cultural issue that's been created that businesses are taking notice of, that there's, and again, more reason why this legislation makes sense. Let's take all that guessing work out of it. Let's just share the information, the true information. And then the number that Mark just said, he's earning 105,000. Well, no, Mark's a liar, because Mark's earning 95, because that's the top of the range, you know? So I do think that things are changing, especially as it relates to that.
How can people join the movement?
So if you're interested in equal pay in Massachusetts, you can reach out directly to me, and I will absolutely join you into this fight in Massachusetts. If you live somewhere else and you want this legislation on the books where it is, I also encourage you to talk to me. One of the things that I stepped down as a CEO in January of 2020, and I've literally devoted my time to this effort. I have a consultancy, and I do a lot of work on that, but this is kind of what I do. And my interest is to take this much more broad, right? My interest is to take this show on the road, if you will, and make sure that all 50 states have equal pay acts in place that include the language for the amendment in Massachusetts. So if you're interested in taking this show on the road in the state where you live, let's also talk, because there might be some resources and people that I could put you in touch with to get that started. And I would love to do that. And we even talked about doing another kind of like more interactive one-on-one session after this for people who really are interested in pay equity and want to make this change happen. I'm more than happy to share everything that I know in more detail and really kind of get my hands dirty and get involved with helping you pursue it.
Thank you, Megan. I guess for me, it's that whether you see yourself in this journey, whether you see yourself, advancing legislation for wrongs that you think need to be righted, or that there is infrastructure built for fairness and equity across the country. I think the information that we learned today is knowledge is power. And there's so many of us that feel silenced when it comes to talking about what our pay is, how we feel in an organization related to how we're compensated. What is our upward mobility? Do we have opportunities to advance to levels of manager, director, CEO? Those are conversations that I think people are having in their homes amongst one another when it feels comfortable. Hopefully what this does is it brings it to light to where we can have those open conversations in organizations. And it's not a shocker for CEOs and directors to say, yeah, I've heard about that, and I'm prepared to have a conversation with you about that and what that looks like for you and how you advance. Pay is a very intimate thing for most all of us. It's the way that we fund our lives. No matter how much money we make, where we live in the country, it's the way we take care of our families. And we're finding that it's a topic that is often not discussed openly. So I want to thank Megan for really inspiring a journey for all of us to take a look at. I also hope that people walk away with, no matter what you look like, no matter what your background is, no matter how much money you make, we all have the right to have a conversation with our representatives and our legislators. And we all have the right to ask questions and demand that they work for us, that they really speak the voice of the communities that they represent. So thank you, Megan, for everything. I know that we will be sending out a follow-up survey, follow-up information. If you feel like you want to have a deeper conversation about advancing legislation, even if it's not in the Equal Pay Act world or wage transparency world, I think a blueprint, Megan can share her experience and you can take it from there. Thank you everybody for your time. Thank you to our ASL interpreters. You are amazing. Thank you to our FFI staff, Sasha and Matthew. And again, thank you to Megan for your time and your energy and your passion. We hope you have a great day, and we look forward to all of you being a part of the Blueprint community. Have an awesome day.